Let's get started. Welcome everyone to this CEA webinar. We're going to be focusing on making outcome-based policies effective. I'm excited to have some industry representatives from across the US discussing a little bit more about what how they're implementing some of these policies within their jurisdictions and different agencies, and how we can maybe take some of those lessons learned and incorporate that more into some of the work that CEA is doing. So really appreciate everyone being here today as we talk through this, and we hope to have some lively discussion at the end after our presenters have had a chance to share a little bit more about them. So as we do with all CEA meetings, just want to recognize our CEA antitrust statement. I won't read it, but just recognize that we do have that in place in case anything does arise. And so then for today's agenda, I'm going to give a quick little level set as to what we mean by outcome-based policies. Again, that's an initiative from the California Energy Alliance, and what we're kind of trying to achieve with this, whether it's the terminology and why we're looking at outcome-based policies and what that really means. And so do a quick kind of just level set of where we're at with terminology and what's coming, and then turn it over to our presenters from the city of Seattle, Dwayne Johnland, city of Boulder, Carolyn Elam, city of Chula Vista, Colleen Wisniewski, and then from the EPA, Karen Butler. Got to dive in a little bit more into what policies they have and how they're being implemented. We really want to get towards what are the challenges, what are some of the concerns, what's happening across the U.S., what folks are seeing, the shift maybe from focus on new buildings to existing buildings and what that means. And so kind of really package everything in between and see if there's some takeaways that CEA can have to be able to continue to further usher along our outcome-based policies initiative. So there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. I've got some questions queued up to moderate the panel, and then definitely want to hear from the attendees regarding your take, your questions, kind of things you want to hear. So we'll have that at the end to be able to really understand how can we continue to try to bridge this gap between new buildings, major retrofits into ongoing building operations. So with that, again, I'm going to let the panelists really introduce themselves and the work that they're doing within their jurisdiction or their agency. But we do, like I said, we do have Dwayne Johnland, Carolyn Elam, Colleen Wisniewski, and Karen Butler joining us today. Really excited to have them on this panel because, we've got this good mix of jurisdictions that have had an outcome-based code in place, beginning to focus on building performance standards or that existing building market, and then learn about some tools that can maybe help bridge that gap between new buildings and existing buildings. So, like I said, I'm going to give a quick little rundown of where we're at with outcome-based policies, why this is an initiative of CEA and what that kind of means. Ever since its founding, CEA has had this focus around outcome-based codes, and now this terminology sort of shifted a little bit. And so internally, we've really focused, or we'll be focusing our initiative around outcome-based policies to really encompass everything from new buildings to existing buildings as we see building performance standards continue to grow across the US. And so with that, the idea behind an outcome-based code and the reasons why is that the energy code is complex. We're sort of missing some of the energy end uses in the building, and sort of some of the concerns around compliance and enforcement with the code and what that would look like if we maybe put a little bit more emphasis after certificate of occupancy or once there's already some operations. So, we've had this in place. We've been looking at it. We've been shifting to an OBP because there's a lot of these questions around, what's the impact to the occupants? How do we get that feedback from the various stakeholders along this process? What does it mean from a local or state effort? California is looking at a statewide building performance standard, and a number of jurisdictions have done it. Other states are looking into it. But what really is this outcome-based code versus building performance standard? I think the big questions around liability, data collection, metrics being used, all of that really requires some research and understanding of how to align new buildings to existing buildings. And a lot of that work is happening across the US. So some of you probably saw this at our March meetings, but again, a good recap of sort of the differences between an outcome-based code and what we mean by building performance standards. and why we can kind of use this umbrella of outcome-based policies. Whereas outcome-based codes really rely on measured energy use instead of the estimated estimates based on expected connected load or modeling. And so really looking at how to design and build a building and then use what's sort of the measured energy use to show compliance after 12 months, maybe 18 months. Now, there's a lot of things we'll unpack with sort of liability concerns, issues, metrics, as to maybe why that doesn't really work that well, but begin to figure out, is there some maybe new tools or resources to help bridge that gap? To really, again, to put that emphasis on post-occupancy issues. And so building performance standards have obviously been growing a lot to pick up the slack on existing buildings and where we're seeing, older buildings, but also what that means for new buildings. And so a BPS, according to the DOE, are outcome-based policies and laws aimed at reducing the carbon impact of the built environment by requiring existing buildings to meet energy and or greenhouse gas emissions based performance targets. So, and again, with this chart or this graphic here from P&L, really just looking at, how these policies begin to overlap from new codes and the model energy code that gets developed, every 3 years or so, depending on the jurisdiction or the state. You've got local energy codes that are then, implementing that state code or that national code, and how that looks from a building under construction, review the permits, the building starts, and then, sort of the benchmarking and building performance standard requirements really begin. And so that BPS period can really, begin to overlap a lot of this. But I think there should still be, and at CEA, we've talked about this a lot, this major focus on compliance and enforcement with the energy code, because we want to make sure that these buildings are set up for success and not necessarily for failure if there is now a BPS target in place. And so, again, I'm not going to go into these, but the reasons why we have Seattle and Boulder and Chula Vista and the EPA on this webinar is because they're already implementing some of this. They've had it for a while, where there's an outcome-based code. They're beginning to look at it from a building performance standard perspective. They've got some good lessons learned and some key reasons as to maybe why some of these aren't good policies, but how can we maybe begin to look at fixing some of those so that we can continue to bridge that gap from new buildings to existing buildings. And kind of, again, just to a highlight of what, building performance standard might look like, and this can vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction, state to state, but it's really about, mandated energy and or emissions reduction through some sort of set performance targets over a time period. And so various ones will look at energy use, some may look at greenhouse gas emissions. So that'll vary, and you'll hear that from some of the folks that will speak today. But I think that also then brings about some of the complexity of a BPS and how do we maybe link that back to new building energy codes to understand, are these buildings performing the way that we had intended them to? As I mentioned, BPS is continuing to grow across the US. IMT always updates this map and does a really good job of understanding, who's committed, who's already passed, where these types of policies are in place. And as you can see, for California, City of Chula Vista, which is why we had Colleen on the call, has already implemented one and is beginning that process. But so many of these are still so new that some of those lessons learned are more about how to get them going versus what they're seeing from places that are already reporting, for many years, because they just haven't been around that long. And so with that, I want to know that things like a building performance standard are coming, and that's going to begin to impact existing buildings. But CEA has had a lot of focus on new building codes and what that looks like and major renovations, and so how those will begin to impact. And so there's a lot of things to consider when you think about both, because there's a wide range of outcomes, from a building performance perspective, from new building codes. There's a lot of different metrics being used, from meeting code compliance to building performance standard compliance. There's usually those metrics on the line. And then also, there's this need to really strengthen metering and commissioning, and some things that CEA has really been trying to push, but gets limited or kind of lacking in the new energy code due to cost effectiveness metrics. It's more enabling technologies. So we'll kind of look at those common themes too, as to what's really maybe missing on the new building side that can help support a building whenever it becomes existing and has to meet a future BPS. And so hopefully we'll dive into a little bit more with Karen and the EPA about some tools that can help bridge that gap, maybe finding some commonalities with metrics to at least begin to understand a little bit from a design side, how it could predict what its predicted energy use might be and how we can kind of revert back to that. But I think the goal is to really dive into each of these, understand where there's some common themes, where there's some technologies coming on board, where there's still some policy driving this, both internally from California and local jurisdictions, but nationwide, and what that's looking like, and how we can maybe tap into tools that the EPA and DOE have and funding to help support the implementation of these types of policies. So to kind of wrap it up, CEA, as I mentioned at the beginning, has this outcome-based policies initiative. And so our goal is to really understand how can we sort of reduce the barriers to get these policies in place? How do we begin to get better technologies and strategies in the new building code so that existing buildings can perform better, continue to perform better, and report out what that performance looks like, again, to kind of help hopefully meet some future building performance standards. And I think, what I would also like to see from this and from the discussion and from all the CEA folks, thinking about how we can take this discussion into our October meetings and really think about how compliance and enforcement might be that critical juncture, both from new buildings, but also into existing buildings and, a BPS, how that ongoing performance gets enforced. And so I think that'll be a lot of the kind of questions we'll dive into during the panel. So I'm going to pass it off to our speakers to talk about how they're implementing some outcome-based policies, to give a quick rundown of who they are, what their jurisdiction is doing, and then we'll save questions unless maybe you have a clarifying question on their slides. But other than that, we'll try to save questions for the moderated panel. Like I said, we'll have plenty of time to really dive into each of these different areas. So let's get started with the City of Seattle and Dwayne Johnlin.
Hey, thanks a lot, Josh. Why don't you get on to my first slide there. I'm Dwayne Johnlin. I'm the Energy Code Advisor for Seattle, and I think the designated wet blanket for this presentation regarding outcome-based codes. I am guilty of having been speaking around the country a decade ago about what a great idea this was, and have the distinction of maybe having the only actual functioning outcome-based code going anywhere in our Seattle code. And so I'm in an especially good position to say that this doesn't work. It's, as you see with the H.L. Mencken quote down below, this outcome-based codes is one of those complex problems that has a solution that is clear, simple, and wrong. Because it's got to be either voluntary or mandatory, right, as a code. If it's voluntary, if people can choose it, there isn't any reason for any owner to choose an outcome-based path. It's simply increasing their risk and delay and uncertainty, and there's really nothing in it for them. If it's a mandatory code, if it's going to apply to everybody, then you're up against that issue of setting fair and reasonable targets for every building type. For instance, you can imagine an office tower where there's one floor that's a call center. It's got little cubicles and electronics from wall to wall and full of people trying to sell you whatever it is they sell online these days. And the next floor up is the executive floor, and it's got tasteful lighting and generous offices and probably uses a quarter of the energy that the floor below is, but they both are offices. So how fine-grained you'd have to get would get really crazy. You'd have to have fair and reasonable penalties for the people who didn't comply, because if you don't have any penalties, then there isn't any reason that people comply. The building department, any of you that work for building departments know that we have no money ever for anything, and we would still be responsible for tracking these buildings off into the future, and we'd have to have staff on hand who would handle all the complaints and questions, and you'd have to form an appeals board, and it gets really complicated. Next slide, please. So the building performance standard, on the other hand, I think is a really smart policy to get going on existing buildings. I think in Washington State, ours is set like at the 60th percentile for existing buildings, but that's all buildings, from last year back to 1882 or something like that. The actual performance is pretty poor. So bringing it up to average or a little above average is reasonable. A couple issues I wanted to just highlight, lest we think this is a bed of roses, is that process loads are a very tricky issue. By that, I mean, if you open a new laundromat or restaurant, hospital, imaging center, data center, any of these, the more successful you are, the more energy you're going to use. So even a tiny coffee shop, if yours down the block is so popular that you've got to line out the door from morning till night, and mine is just barely poking along and hardly has any customers, I will look like an energy use hero. You'll look like an energy use goat. But it's very tricky to come up with a BPS that recognizes process loads. And the other one that I worry about is that probably the lowest income people and organizations are going to be in the buildings that have had the least work done on them over the decades, and they're going to be performing very badly. So by having a building performance standards that applies to every place, you might be causing a lot of difficulty for low income areas. Next slide, please. Just regards to that question about whether current codes might, you might build to a current code and have it not comply with the BPS. See that blue oval on the left there for mid-rise office? That's about what a new mid-rise office building in Seattle would have an EUI down in the low 30s somewhere. That highlighted couple numbers are the best local mid-rise office buildings at EUIs that are less than half of that, right? Or and then the oval over on the right is what we have set for the building performance target for mid-rise office buildings, double what our current new buildings are and triple what our best ones are. So I don't really think there is an issue, but let's take a look at the next slide. So if I'm going to be cranky about all these other things, what is my idea here? It's boring, sorry, but that's that's my job. So first thing is build the thing right, have a really bang up energy code, an energy code that makes it very hard to use inefficient technologies like gas or electric resistance heating, commissioning and metering that are set up and enforced, and really thorough enforcement at the plan review and the inspection level, especially with the commissioning, to make sure that everything is up and going properly to begin with. And then once it's operating, there are other policies you can put in place. The building performance standards we'll be talking about more today. Perhaps you set a different one for recent buildings than you've got for the average. Seattle's also got a building tune-ups policy in place where medium and large buildings all over town have to, every several years, go through all their energy using systems and make sure that everything is running properly and fix all the easy and obvious stuff. If you find some uninsulated pipe, you got to wrap it. If you've got dead relays or incorrectly set thermostats or whatever, those get fixed every time we go through that. Public labeling might be another thing. I was just in New York City and passed buildings with their little sticker in the front window that said they were grade A, they're doing really well, and others that were grade D that are doing very poorly. And I think that might give somebody about to sign a lease pause if they come to the building and it's got the big D sticker in the window. So that could help. And finally, there's software being developed now. I don't know if it's off the shelf available yet, but that you can set up software that has your whole building, its digital twin in the software, and will compare it with the energy use of your building with real-time weather and occupancy data, so you can see right away if something is running differently than was intended. So there's some options there for operating it right after you've built it right. And I think that might be, as unromantic as it is, the most successful approach. And that's the end of my little spiel.
Thanks, Dwayne. Always appreciate your insight into this, because you were the big advocate for outcome-based codes originally, and then how we can sort of shift that focus. But I think what you have here, the sort of build it right, operate it right. But we'll dive into how do we really get this going.
New Buildings Institute, NBI, caught the same fever for several years, and they were out there pushing this, and they're sour on it too now. So I think it's time to put this to bed for California.
Thanks, Dwayne. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn Elam at the City of Boulder now. Carolyn?
Yeah, thanks. And I always love following Dwayne, because then I can blame him for all of our failed attempts, which is great. So thanks, everybody. I'm Carolyn Elam. I'm on our climate side at the City of Boulder, but also work closely with our Planning and Development Services Department on the implementation of our building codes and regulations. So next slide, please. So just a quick backdrop of where Boulder's been just overall on our energy codes and how this informs and the outcome-based pathways going forward. So for decades, we've always strived to be better than the most recent International Energy Conservation Code. We adopted a standalone code actually in 2017, which is the City of Boulder Energy Conservation Code. Just because we were making so many local amendments, it became easier just to maintain our own code. I highlight 2020 because this is the code update where we moved to an EUI target pathway for new construction. So we did adopt EUI targets for a subset of our building types, based on a extensive analysis of this, what we were seeing locally, the P&L, NBI studies, all of those things inform the setting of the targets, and I'll show you what those are in just a minute. This is also where we were part of the outcome-based code fever at the time, introduced an actual outcome-based performance pathway, and set expectations that we were going to ultimately move towards an outcome verified code by 2030. In 2020, our outcome-based performance pathway was a voluntary compliance mechanism, and I'll talk about the mechanics of it in just a second. We just adopted our updated code earlier this year, moving to the 2024 version. In this one, we added some additional EUI targets, but we also removed our outcome-based performance pathway. Again, for many of the reasons that Dwayne just said, and I can talk about that. And then trajectory-wise, we're really focusing now on operational emissions as our 2030 target. Next slide. So these are the current operating targets that we have for our EUI pathway. In the current code, which remains in place until December, the new 2024 code, which takes up in December. You can see that with our code update, we added large office. In the Boulder context, I should be clear that we don't build above 4-story new construction anymore. We're all lower rise as a community. We don't have a lot of new building construction, but still, this is where we're at. We did add large office, retail, and restaurant with the idea of getting some of our multi-use buildings, which was the predominant thing that wasn't following our EUI pathway. The great news about introducing the EUI pathway in 2020 is almost every project that was eligible, actually every project that was eligible to follow the EUI pathway did. And so we do have now buildings that have been constructed and are now operating where we had a target design for that building. So next slide. So again, when we conceived the pilot, the idea here is that we would entice projects to come into the pilot by allowing them to set less aggressive EUI targets than what we were requiring under the base pathway. We structured it as a retainage where we would set aside a retainage deposit based on the square footage of the property. After a year of occupancy, they would have to provide measured performance data, and we do have a benchmarking ordinance, which I'll talk about in a second. And if the building performed at or better than the target, they get the full retainage back. If they failed to achieve the target, we would require that they use the retainage to make corrections. They'd file a corrective action plan with the city, make those corrections, and then up until they expended the retainage, and then there would be no penalty, and they would just move forward. So that was the construct that we came up with. Nobody chose that pathway. It was easier for them simply to follow the target pathway as it was. I think as we reviewed it and tracked the same kind of learnings that Dwayne shared with you, one of the biggest challenges here is the design team and the contractors build and design the property to the best of their control and capability. But once it transitions over to the owner and occupants, like there's no longer that ability to control or relationship, and trying to prescribe that relationship for a year or more period of time was something we were concerned around from an enforcement perspective and also just a practical perspective. Again, the complexity of this design and considerations about enforceability, when you're capacity constrained on your code review and enforcement teams to begin with, there's a lot of challenge in trying to figure out like what's going to repair or correct the issue. And so we chose at this point, as we dropped it in 2024, to really move more towards this building performance standards type approach. We have not adopted anything at this point, but I'll talk a little bit about what we're thinking there. As Dwayne shared, there's certainly a lot of consideration around historical buildings, and we can go to the next slide. We've had a benchmarking ordinance in place in Boulder since 2016, so we have a lot of historical data. And this is just showing you how our buildings are actually performing based on their year of construction. And you can see a wide diversity there. There's also different building types in this mix. So there's variability among common types of buildings, and then there's wide variability depending on the different types of buildings that you see, particularly for the older buildings, and trying to consider how we want to structure a building performance standard to take into account those equity pieces that Dwayne already touched on. But if we move to the next slide, one thing we have observed as we look at this data, as we've gotten better as a municipality in enforcing our codes at the time of construction, at ensuring that we're doing good early commissioning of the buildings and enforcement of the requirements, we've definitely seen a narrowing down in the actual measured performance of these buildings once they're constructed. So really validating this point of making sure it's built well. And then the other thing, like Dwayne was mentioning, we also have a retro commissioning requirement through our building performance that requires them to tune it. I think as we look forward on how we want to get outcome verified codes under our EUI pathway, we're considering that it's reasonable to expect at least our more newly constructed buildings constructed under our current codes and back to the 2020 code, that we can set BPS targets really tied to what they were designed to perform, with some allowance for some of those process load considerations, but we're still noodling on really what the construct of the BPS will be related to some of the legacy buildings, the equity considerations, all of those factors and challenges, but that's the trajectory that we're on. So we've, like Dwayne, moved away from the idea of tying the outcome portion to our construction codes. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Carolyn. Appreciate that. And we'll circle back with some questions and some lessons learned. And now I'm going to turn it over to Colleen Wisniewski with the City of Chula Vista. Colleen.
Hi there. Good morning or afternoon, wherever you're located. Colleen Wisniewski, City of Chula Vista. We go to the next slide. So really appreciate the information my colleagues just shared. We are definitely the newer kids on the block as far as tackling this issue here in Chula Vista in Southern California. I want to just highlight a little bit about our BPS. I always love good case studies, so hopefully this is helpful for those of you that aren't familiar with us here in Chula Vista. And we do not have it all figured out. Even though we have a BPS, there's still a lot to learn and a lot of adjusting that we'll be doing along the way. But we'll just dive in here on the next slide. So our most recent climate action plan, we actually had our first climate action plan in the year 2000. So the city's been thinking about sustainability and our communities and our own buildings, our municipal buildings for a long time. In our most recent climate action plan, there was a target of retrofitting a certain amount of multifamily in commercial space by 2035. So that's what we were starting to think about with our consultant back in 2017 and even a little bit before that, as we started thinking about what would our cap look like. But one of the things specifically called out was for a building performance reporting, as well as the public disclosure piece, which is a little bit about what Dwayne was mentioning earlier when he was walking through New York City and saw some signage. So we tried to incorporate some of that as well. City Council, upon their approval of our climate action plan, directed staff to develop a residential and commercial energy conservation ordinance. Lots of words there. But basically we were looking at various ordinances, and one of the ones we landed on was a building performance standard for our multifamily, commercial, and industrial buildings in Chula Vista. So next slide, please. I think many of you are familiar with California. They already had AB 802, which required buildings 50,000 square feet and over to report their energy use annually. It was around that same time that rolled out that our climate action plan was adopted. So that was great. We had some buildings in Chula Vista that should have been reporting to that. But one of the things we did that we were trying to take advantage of as different states are looking at their own requirements. California allowed local control. So building owners could report to us, and then we would report on behalf of those building owners directly to the state. So there were some other cities in California doing various, different things on their building stock as well. So we wanted to go beyond our state requirements. We had other REACH codes previously, and so we decided to dive into the world of BPS. So on the next slide, as you're aware, California is 50,000 square feet and above, and all they're doing is benchmarking in the state. We wanted to look at our building stock and see a city of Chula Vista that's about 280,000 residents. What does our building stock look like? So we looked, we had a little less than 400 buildings that should have been reporting to the state already with AB 802. Very few were actually reporting a few years into that. And then we decided, what if we looked to lower our threshold? What kind of impact could we have? So we realized if we lowered our threshold to 20,000 square feet, we could hit roughly an additional almost 500 buildings. So that sounded pretty good to us. We had some metrics there about what the amount of those buildings were emitting each year. So that kind of helped us figure out where we're setting our target. So we'll go to the next slide. So our ordinance, we were keeping in mind what the state was requiring, looking at what our climate action plan goals, like I mentioned, 20,000 square feet and above buildings are reporting annually. At the 5th year of reporting, it would require audits to buildings that are not performing well. We're using site EUI, Energy Star score. And if buildings are not, we are currently using Energy Star score. If buildings are not hitting an 80 or above on their Energy Star score, then we're looking at doing some requirements along the way. Not all building types, as you probably are aware, can get an Energy Star score. And in that case, we're looking at site EUI. We have some metrics on that to help guide those requirements as well. So at that 5th year, if buildings aren't performing well, they would need to do an audit. And then certain buildings would need to do retro commissioning as well, which is something my colleagues have mentioned earlier. And then we want to make sure that the audit reports don't sit on a shelf. We want things to be addressed over time as well, with those performance standards in later years. Next slide. So here it is in a nutshell. So essentially, buildings are reporting every single year. At the 5th year, the very first year, and we've had to adjust our dates already because it's a lot to set up here in the beginning. In 2026, currently, that would be the first year that our buildings would be having to hit targets and either doing potentially doing audits and retro commissioning. And then 2031 would be the year that folks might need to have their buildings hitting those numbers. So we're trying to hit buildings earlier and let the word out, let people know that this is a long game and that they should be thinking about things earlier. I'm going to go to my next slide. We do have fees and fines written into our ordinance. Not the most amazing time ever. We had been working on this ordinance forever, but we took this to our Sustainability Commission in the spring of 2020. So folks weren't really very excited about us proposing potential benchmarking fees or fines for buildings, even though we had been working on this ordinance design for years before that. We'd actually worked back and forth with our Sustainability Commission for about 9 months. And by the time we got to City Council in early 2021, they were pretty supportive of this. So fees and fines were approved in our ordinance, but we are not currently enacting either of those at the moment. And to be honest, we're probably going to also be readjusting this with an ordinance update in the next year or so. When fees and fines may come into play, we hope, city staff at least, to have those go into a fund to help support buildings that have been identified as priority buildings, according to our Chula Vista Climate Equity Index. Next slide, please. So again, recap, it was approved in early 2021. We thought we'd be amazing and start rolling it out later that year. Luckily, we decided to wait until 2022 because it takes a lot of setup. And I think we'll talk about, lessons learned in a few minutes. Our staff, it's a very small team. We are finding and notifying the building owners. We provide some hand holding. Literally, my colleague Janella is on a call now, giving someone some information on how to enter their data in Energy Star Portfolio Manager, but really also trying to connect building owners to existing programs that might be out there in the state or federally. So doing that. We also have a data portal which shows the data, kind of going along with some of my colleagues mentioned earlier, which hopefully promotes more efficient buildings to potential buyers or tenants. That was one of the big things that was actually called out but in our climate action plan was the disclosure of the data to hopefully provide a big market transformation of building stock here in Chula Vista. And next slide. Real quick, I'm not going to go into this too much. This is a data platform. So this is like the easy piece where you can go in and look at buildings in Chula Vista and how they're performing. Next slide. If you click on one of the buildings, you'll see some detailed information on those buildings. No customer data is shown, but you'll see, or no identifying data, but you'll see some of the metrics there. So if you're savvy and want to look at buildings, you can check that out. Next. I think I have one or two more. So I mentioned resources. How do we provide things to the building owners and operators? Because this is one of my big concerns is I don't want to overburden building owners with complying to this. So we're planning our second in-person event, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, about linking those owners or operators to existing resources. So we have one in a couple weeks at our library where we invite folks in, provide lunch, tell them about all the great things out there so that they can start planning those investment opportunities, or how are they going to hit these targets later. So trying to get them there. We also have some online resources as well that include video tutorials about how to do this. Again, listing some of those options that might be existing currently. We also have a survey. We don't get a ton of responses on it, but we want to make sure that staff are able to help people or, reduce that burden. So always trying to get the input from our building owners. Next slide, please. And then I mentioned again a moment ago about equity. We have this climate equity index. We're in the process of securing some funding to support the costs of audits, retro commissioning. And one big thing we've learned from our colleagues in other jurisdictions around the country is the need for data verification. Now that we have a few years worth of data under our belts, it's been illuminating to see the wide range of responses we get. So we're looking at adding a data verification requirement every 5 years, the year before those other targets, to make sure the data really is accurate. And then we then hope to leverage our climate equity index to hopefully provide extra resources for those buildings in our climate equity zones. I think I may have one more slide. Oh, that's it. So a little
Awesome.
case study for you all, and then hopefully we can dive into some of the questions Josh has prepared for us.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Colleen. Definitely took a couple notes there to circle back to, but really appreciate you sharing more about Chula Vista. And so now, we've heard from some jurisdictions, but want to turn it over to Karen Butler with the EPA's Energy Star Commercial Building Design Program and share some information about maybe there's some tools out there to begin linking some of these new buildings to existing buildings, not to add additional layers to the building permitting process, but if there's some opportunities there, I think we might want to take advantage of that. So I'm gonna let Karen share more about this program. Karen. Can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, no, you're good.
Okay, great. And I'm going to go off screen while I talk because I fidget a lot and it is a distraction. So I will come back on when we do today.
Okay.
So thanks, Josh and company for having me to be part of this session. And as you said, I'm Karen Butler. I've been with the EPA and working on energy efficiency for the last 30 years or so, and trying to help to bridge the gap between design and performance. I joined them as a graduate of architecture school, did my graduate work in architecture, and most of my efforts were spent in the energy efficiency realm. And so as a result, that's how I kind of got involved in this effort. Next slide, please. Okay, there we go. All right. So as I was saying, so we're going to talk about building performance standards, energy codes, and of course, I'm going to try to link how Energy Star fits into this to help make these outcome-based policies effective. So currently BPS, or Building Performance Standards, I'm going to call them BPS, and sometime I'll say it out, mainly focus on existing buildings. But guess what? All of these new buildings will become existing buildings and will be held to those same standards. So on the design side, so in 1999, 25 years ago, when we were all partying before the millennial, I created a little tool called Target Finder. And the goal of Target Finder was for designers or owners or whoever can go in and dial up their building characteristics and get an Energy Star score if the building type was applicable, but you could get an EUI as well, an energy use intensity target. So when you didn't have any other information, it's like you could go in and dial up these targets. So with building performance, activities come in, why not use those numbers or your desired energy target during design to help guide to focus energy decisions to meet your performance goal? That's what this whole thing is all about. This has been the focus of Energy Star for commercial new construction for the last 20 years, and why we created the Design to Earn Energy Star recognition, which I'll just briefly mention as we go on, and that's getting to those Energy Star targets. Now others are beginning to get board with this activity, and even the building code professionals are investigating how to better align their codes with building performance. And I'm kind of with Dwayne on that. I don't know if codes need to be completely performance-based. I think there are other opportunities where we can bridge the gap and help people understand. And as I go through, you'll see some of the thoughts I have on that. Next slide, please. So, hold hold on, there's little notes popping up at me. Sorry. Okay. See, A&E firms must show that their designs can meet an EUI or GHGI or whatever your specified target is. I believe the woman from Colorado had very specific numbers that they were attesting people to meet. So by designing and delivering energy efficient buildings and reducing greenhouse gas emissions by X% amount or by whatever year or whatever your specified pathway, these are going to be the expectations for A&E firms going into the future. Next. So there has been a disconnect. Energy codes particularly focus on implementing the most efficient systems and components and its projected ability to reduce energy and cost. With BPS compliance, it is dependent on actual ongoing performance of the building and considering variables like occupancy, operation, and maintenance. Next. So the three big disconnects are not creating an energy budget based on the actual building performance. Second one is using the same criteria, metrics, and design to measure the building's energy performance. And then the third one we found is not using an integrated design approach that's connected to operational goals. So next, please. So connecting the dots. So being able to connect the dots is paying attention to the building's intended performance when making design decisions and using all the available metrics to develop a comprehensive energy profile for your design. Next. So for an example, in this one connecting, where am I on slide 50? Oh, okay. Connecting the dots require paying attention to the intended performance when making decisions. So for an example, no one metric tells the whole story. So, so the metrics should help you to align your design to operations. So for an example, in this picture, there are key indicators for determining an individual's overall health. And these may change from time to time depending on if other ones become available. So looking at the little graphics over there, I think most of you all know what those are. So when you go to the doctor, they're going to tell you, okay, your cholesterol is good, your heart rate is good, and this is going to give you a good indication of what you need to pay attention to. Same thing with energy for a building. There's different metrics, and I think in the discussion I've heard EUIs, I've heard ENERGY STAR scores, I've heard some climate goals, so there's a grouping of these that we can look at. Next slide. So the same can be said for energy indicators for building design, where each of these metrics are meaningful on their own, but collectively they provide a holistic energy profile of the building. For an example, targeted EUI provides how the business function drives energy use in the building, or an ENERGY STAR score tells the relative efficiency performance of a building on a 1 to 100 scale as compared to its peers and so on, with each metric helping you make decisions based on criteria or selected outcomes such as energy, CO2 emissions, cost reductions, or all of the above, or other criteria. Next. So knowing your numbers and putting it all together can help you make decisions to reach your desired goal as specified in your chart on the bottom right. And if you look at it, it's a little teeny, but one of them has site EUI, another one has GHGI, property goal, and the other one has site or GHGI. So again, having these various numbers can help you understand which you want to achieve. See, next. So this is part of our life cycle graphic that we created using the ENERGY STAR tools, and it shows the targets and metrics for the life of the building, starting with design. So I think this came up in some of it, but I'm going to ask you a question anyway. But did you know that energy design targets and the estimated energy use can be generated and saved in ENERGY STAR Portfolio Manager? I heard one of the presenters say that they store all of their data there. Well, you can also put your design estimates in there as well. Let's see. Yes, and these targets that you dial up when you're looking at your building at the very beginning, they're based on actual energy use data. So we just kind of flip the benchmarking on its the opposite. And instead of getting a score on just your building energy use, you can also get a target based on the building size and location and et cetera. So the portfolio manager allows users to specify, maintain, and connect design metrics to energy benchmark data for a variety of property types. This chart also shows when to use the Energy Star tools during the entire design process, from setting targets, analyzing and comparing design energy estimates to the target, and also show progress towards meeting your goal. So 20 years ago in 2004, EPA created Design to Earn the Energy Star to help A&E firms show that their designs are on track to achieve Energy Star for the building by including the energy design intent of the project in contract proposals. You can't get there if you don't know where you're going. So having a specific target or goal, and BPS is also going to drive this, that is what you're using in design to help you understand what strategies, what characteristics, renewables, energy sources to get you to the end goal. And then for an example, many jurisdictions are using Portfolio Manager to show compliance for meeting BPS. These same tools can also be used to document energy intent to compare to BPS requirements. Next. Okay, so there's the other half of my graph. And so that's once the building is constructed, commission is huge, and the utility bills are generated, then the energy use benchmark and energy and portfolio manager can be added using the same record previously created with the design data to compare the actual to the estimated energy or compare the predicted model relative to the BPS target. So now all of your metrics and numbers are all in the tool together. Let's see. And this helps to provide the design team and the owner with institutional knowledge on how well design decisions translated to operational performance, and provides clear performance metrics for the O&M staff to operate and maintain the building to meet or exceed the goal. Next. So this was a very, very high level overview. I didn't go into kind of how the targets, how the tools do what they do, but coming in October, we're going to do a webinar called Designing to Meet Building Performance and Decarbonization Goals using Energy Star tools. And that's when I will actually break into the tools, show you how they work, what's in there, go to the design tab and show you information. And one other thing, if I can also put up, I know one of the, I believe it was Colorado, said that they get an Energy Star score. We are in the process of refreshing Portfolio Manager tool. And so we are gathering information and things that would be helpful to add to it. And I'm going to lead the part in the design side of it. So this is a great forum that if you have ideas and things that would be wish list type things, I would appreciate, or if you want to get in touch with me, these are things we can also put on the list to add in, especially since some of you are beginning to look at new construction metrics for your tools. This is a great opportunity to get some good feedback from actual users. So that's my 2 cents for today, and I will pass the baton back to Josh to continue us on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thanks to all the other presenters. Again, it's kind of laying the groundwork for some of this discussion that we want to have. And I've seen Dwayne, Carolyn throwing some questions in the chat, and encourage everyone else to do the same. And we'll, you can take yourself off of mute too once we have an opportunity. But I got a couple questions that I do want to bring about to the group, to our panel, because I think, as you can hear, there's still this concern and liability around how do you enforce or require a new building to meet certain metrics that are sort of predicted, and then rely on the occupants, the building owners, the facility managers to live up to that. Kind of hard to do. So there's been a big shift, to focus on existing buildings and building performance standards, and creating those targets that way. And with that, So with that, there comes a lot of questions and challenges and concerns. And so I think from a CEA perspective, we would like to continue to dive into that around what do outcome-based policies really look like? How can we begin to maybe rethink through some of the new building codes to incorporate some of the things that Dwayne mentioned regarding metering, maybe some better commissioning or ongoing commissioning to help, make these buildings achieve what they were intended to, but have some sort of backstop there to help with that. I think, from a CEA perspective, we've tried a lot of those, have looked into this. There's cost effectiveness issue or metrics issues. So a lot to, I think, kind of unpack with that, and we'll get to it. But did just want to quickly highlight there is a lot of this discussion happening in aligning energy codes and building performance standards across the U.S. The National Energy Codes Collaborative through ACEEE has a whole number of tags, so there are technical advisory groups that are meeting to discuss how to align energy codes and BPSs, state implementation goals for implementing BPS, how to support code officials through a BPS, all these kind of things to really understand where there's these challenges, limitations, concerns, whatever. And so this whole kind of bulleted list came out of discussions we had as, sort of speakers and panelists talking through this. I've seen come out from that aligning energy codes and BPS tag. I think it's, as you can hear, so much of it is still so new from a BPS perspective that we don't really have those lessons learned yet. Maybe New York's the furthest along. They're beginning to see issues with new buildings not maybe meeting a BPS or new requirements. So they're kind of the first to begin that. So you're seeing DOE, PNNL, ACEEE, all these other groups try to come together to begin to bridge that gap. And I think that's still the key piece. And so as we go through the questions and this moderated panel, I think these are the things to kind of think about when it's challenges and other ideas and solutions that could maybe help tackle this bigger problem. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing so that we can have all of our panelists sort of pinned up here. So hopefully you're able to, pin myself as well. And if the speakers want to come back online, you can at least see what it is, we're talking about and begin to answer some of these questions. So yeah, I see if you've got some things, please share that in the chat, but I've got a few that I just want to begin with, I think based on the conversations that you all started with, to kind of dive maybe a little bit further into some of the policies y'all have in place. Dwayne, maybe starting with you, I know that, OBC was this kind of shiny new object to begin with. I thought it would help, bridge that gap between new buildings, existing buildings. People just weren't really doing it. It seems like you might have had the most experience in any projects that did pursue an outcome-based code. What's sort of the feedback on ones that did go down that pathway? Was there any sort of, return to say like, oh yeah, they did meet their intent? Did you actually get to follow up with them to learn, are they, meeting what they kind of predicted to do with their energy target? Any other sort of feedback of projects that did actually go down an OBC pathway, compliance pathway?
Yeah, we did have a few existing buildings that chose to do that when they were doing a major alteration because they wanted to hang on to certain aspects of their buildings that they liked that weren't really code compliant. Everybody loves, bare brick walls on their interiors, right, for historic buildings. So a few people went through there, and they actually, did get through and get their energy measured and meet the targets. Since then, there's been a land use policy that allows extra height and bulk for people that meet certain performance targets, and that's the pathway that they were chosen. So people who wanted that zoning bonus had to go through this process. It's a long haul from the time that they submit for permit to the time that they have enough data on hand, for a full year that they can prove that they met their target. Certainly, anybody who's obligated to do this has is paying a lot more attention to making things work than someone who's able to just skip past.
Right. Gotcha. Maybe because I was actually going to ask a question to you, Carolyn, about retrofit in older buildings, as you mentioned, Boulder doesn't really have a whole lot of new construction; it's sort of limited on its space. So if there are larger buildings that are going through, whether it's maybe your EUI target pathway or some other kind of pathway, is that from a major renovation retrofit side of things? And are you seeing those buildings maybe trying to skirt the rules to not have to go through like a new construction pathway, even if they are doing a major retrofit?
Yeah, that's a great question. Generally, the only ones that have gone through our EUI pathway are the new construction. I think it's a little hard to skirt most of the requirements we have that are all stringent, even if you aren't going through the EUI pathway. In our case, so we because we have prescriptive requirements that are pretty aggressive as well. Like the EUI pathway is actually preferred because it gives greater flexibility to designers to meet the energy outcomes than the prescriptive. So what we're seeing in retrofits are going more through prescriptive or modeled pathways, but still fairly stringent. So yeah, we haven't seen a lot of that shift. Again, vintage and recency of construction is certainly a very clear indicator, though, of how our buildings are performing from our benchmarking data. So certainly we're seeing a tightening and maybe a little bit more longevity to performance from some of the buildings that we have enough data on to kind of track that.
Gotcha. Well, maybe feeding off of the question that Dwayne put in there to that point, if you're seeing a lot of them go through the EUI pathways, that potentially mean the EUI is too lenient, or does that get regularly updated?
No, I mean our EUI is pretty aggressive, right? So it's not exactly easy to hit a 23 ERI as a 4-story multifamily building, or those numbers are pretty aggressive. So I don't know that ours are too lenient. I think one of the nuances in the chat I was just commenting is, I think we often don't compare apples to apples, and there's some apples and oranges when you're talking about how EUI may be treated for a newly constructed building versus how portfolio manager is going to treat solar in a benchmarking performance, right? Because who owns renewable energy credits becomes really important there, where it may not be considered in compliance, or you may not have limits in compliance with the EUI under new construction. So by way of example, we don't see buildings hitting our stringent targets without solar, just based on energy performance. There's usually some increment that's being layered in on top of that. So they might get to a 27 and have to make up the final 3 points with solar, as an example, or 4 points. If they then don't, so they met our EUI target, they have a really efficient building, it's tight, it's commissioned, all of that's good. In our benchmarking, that solar will be excluded as a credit towards their benchmark. So they're going to benchmark higher than what they designed to, even if they're performing exactly as designed to. So I think it's just really important to get that apples to apples comparison and make sure that you're accounting for that if we are seeing deviations between the two numbers.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I'll come back to that. I think the metrics, the being able to compare good metrics is going to be a key question. Did you, Karen, do you have a question?
Yes, I didn't understand when she said the solar and then putting it in and taking it out. I didn't quite understand what that was. Maybe that can be clarified or elaborated on.
Yeah, so when we're reviewing the design, at least in Boulder, and there's some changes under the 2024 IECC that start to consider how renewable energy credits are taken into account for compliance. But back in 2020, when we adopted our EUI targets, and I think many others, we care about the total performance of the building. So we credit on-site solar for that building as part of meeting its energy target. So it's how much it's going to consume how much it's produced, divided by the total square footage for the EUI target. Most of our building owners then sell the renewable energy credits to the utility because it buys down the cost of that solar for them. Then when you go to portfolio manager, because those are solar going to the grid and credited to the grid, you don't get generation credit for the building when you're benchmarking. So all that's left is what you're consuming, not what you're generating. So the numbers will be different.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. Okay. Yeah, because in the design world, there is no credit. You know, either you're going to do on-site, when you run your energy model, you're running your energy model based on the fact that you are considering on-site as being part of that model. So your energy profile is going to be based on that. And then you're saying when you get the building and you operate it, then some of it gets sold back. But it still should balance out, because what you get to use for your building, I mean, the solar that you're actually using for your building should reduce your energy usage for that building. And then the rest of it that you're not using and you sell back, no, you don't get credit for that, because the building itself is actually not using that, right? So it should kind of balance out. Now, in terms of costing and all of that, then it'll be different. But in terms of actual consumption, it should balance itself out, because you do get credit, you do use, right? What the building uses, you get credit for that.
Not exactly. So it's just like, it's a little bit of an accounting thing that plays out in terms of renewable energy credits, that it's going to just give you different numbers. And then just again, naming, like Dwayne's point, I loved his barista example of process loads. Definitely have a huge impact on it as well.
Shift gears to Colleen real quick. I think from a perspective of, developing a BPS, beginning to really implement it, kind of generate it from a funding standpoint, CEA has seen some things with the energy code and just sort of enforcement and compliance and what that means from a building department or inspection department, permitting office. What does that look like from your sustainability office and trying to develop a building performance standard? And then how do you get that funding to get it going? And I know there's some stuff coming out from IRA and DOE, but what about ongoing? If you can't really rely on the fees and fines, or you're trying to not really fine everyone, where does that funding come from to keep that program ongoing when it does take a lot of resources to do the outreach, do the follow-up, to track and all that kind of stuff?
That's a big question, right? We've been working on this for a while, certainly not as long as some of these other jurisdictions on the line. I know some other jurisdictions have some amazing things set up as far as funding and ways to offer incentives and rebates for folks. Something I've been jealous of for a little while, to be honest. But we're thinking about, how do we do that? How do we make this sustainable over time? My colleague Janelle's on the line now as well. So between the two of us, this is the team for roughly 800 buildings. And I think for now we have it under control, but as we start rolling into those later phases, which are right around the corner, with potential data verification, looking at audits and retro commissioning, and then, a few years after that, making sure buildings are hitting those targets, it's a lift. And certain times of the year are pretty crazy around here. We are in the process of securing some funding, which could be up to 9 years, which is huge for us. When we created this ordinance, I didn't feel really awesome about having an annual benchmarking fee for building owners, because already they're going to have to do things. Like I mentioned earlier, it's written into the ordinance as well as fines. But we had to think about, how could we keep this staffed or increase staffing, when we're in the general fund? How do we do that? How do we make sure we have the team we need to do this? So that's a really good question. I'm really hopeful that this funding that I'm working on now is gonna come to fruition in a couple months. We seem to be on target, fingers crossed, but that only gets us so far. It's great, it's huge if we can have like up to 9 years of funding, but then what? And I'm getting ready to write my council reports to take this for approval. And I have to talk about the fact that like, yay, we might be getting this giant chunk of money, but what happens at year 10? And if I hire people now, how does that work? So yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. And that is one of the biggest questions I have, or concerns I have, is making sure that we have the staffing we need. And the other big thing as well is the reducing the burden on building owners for compliance. One of the colleagues earlier on the call talked about, kind of brought this up, and how like the you know, like maybe the least well-performing buildings are often ones that are, you know, under-resourced or in areas of the city that, you know, maybe don't have boatloads of money floating around. So how do we address that in a way, you know, keeping equity in mind? I don't want to, you know, leave those folks behind. So those are always in the back of my mind, and I don't have the magic bullet. One of the things as well, as we look forward to, we're probably updating our ordinance in the next, you know, year. And one of the things we'll likely be looking at is potentially adjusting the amount of fines. And I'm not so worried about the fees at this point, but the fines. How do you find that balance of what that could be when we eventually enact them? I don't want people to just pay every year and like say, okay, good, I'm good for this year. I paid my fine of whatever. I want people to actually improve building. So it's a good question. I don't know if anyone has it figured out. If so, let me know.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone on the panel has kind of response to that. I mean, I think what you really highlight the difference between a fee and a fine. You know, the fee is more of just to have to report, you know, to you to kind of keep it going, thinking of like a permit fee to get the permitting process going, to help, that kind of helps the inspection department. So that's kind of what I was saying is like, yeah, what are those ongoing fees, or are the fines, you know, enough to go into the fund to help improve other buildings like you talked about with your kind of equity index, but then also to help support the program itself to continue to move forward past year 8 or 9, or once this DOE funding dries up, you know, what does that look like?
Yeah, so, and just one thing I didn't hit on my answer, my long-winded answer, was that this will sit firmly in the Office of Sustainability, so my staff. So while we work with our Development Services Department on, you know, sort of creating this ordinance, most of the onus will be on our team to enforce later, at least in this current iteration. So I want to make sure I have enough staff to, when we get to that point, make sure that
right,
we can do that.
I'd like to that the staffing would be heavily front-loaded, getting the system set up, figuring out how many buildings you have in town that are going to have to report, and who owns those buildings and how you contact them, and all that. That's really hard, and that's before anything is getting going that you can charge a fee for. So you've got to devote some staff resources to getting it started. Once the whole system is going, then that staffing need is reduced somewhat. And if there are penalties coming in, that can support part of it. But like Colleen said, we don't want the money. We want the buildings to perform better. So we have to set the penalties to be stringent enough that people, it's more economical to comply with the rule than to pay the fine. And then that starts to maybe have some difficult ramifications with buildings that are serving lower income communities.
I think that's a good, maybe also segue in what you're kind of mentioning too, Colleen, to Karen. You know, your department's in charge of, you know, the building performance standard side of things. You've got on a new construction side, that's the inspection department, and that's a whole different department within the city. Karen, kind of a two-part question, you know, from a design to earn Energy Star program, where are you seeing the jurisdictions and cities, and maybe like how many are actually utilizing that program? And if so, is there a way that they can then use it to help bridge that handoff from, you know, a design and, you know, newly constructed building, permitted, within a system, how that can then sort of bridge that gap between different building departments, or sorry, different city departments?
I don't know if I can answer that question. I think the jurisdictions will have to answer that. I think the best thing is to put out the fact that these tools exist. I don't know how many of them are actually using them and putting the design data in, say, Portfolio Manager. I know a lot of people will use Target Finder and, then they'll do their business and they get going, but you can also save it. And I think the big thing is to be able to sit there and look at this stuff and have the design numbers. And then when you start populating those buildings with existing building data or utility data, you begin to build these profiles or these data pools, if you would, just like you would with anything else. And I think that's where the whole magic starts, is when you begin to collect the data and then having ways to synthesize it to see if what you have is getting you to where you want to go. And I have a school district that has done Design to Earn. I think they ran maybe 20 school buildings through Design to Earn, and every one of them received their Energy Star. That's because the school district was committed to making this happen. They looked at it, it was like a fiscal responsibility, plus they had benchmarked a bunch of their other existing schools, so they understood the process of benchmarking, what it was about. And it also helped them to understand how they had to run their schools in order to achieve and maintain their stars. And when a star fell off of the school or they didn't get a star, the community knew about it. And they're like, well, where's our star? And so it was the commitment and the involvement of not only the school district, the communities, and so on. It really helped to push it forward. And then in those communities, in those areas that were say lacking with resources, then they could prioritize those schools in the cases where these would mainly be retrofits and start updating those schools. So I think the whole idea here is that this is all about the commitment, and this is how you reduce the risk, is that if the owner does not have buy-in and does not understand what it is they're doing and the benefit of this, yes, you're going to have risk. You're going to have risk even if they do know. But when they do understand benchmarking, using benchmarking to make decisions about performance, and then figuring out ways, whether it's contract, performance contracts, or however it is that they gain funds and commitment from their district, in this case, in the school district, so that they can actually do these upgrades. I think I heard people talk about auditing, having audits in place, so that understands the performance that they need to get to and what things they need to tweak. And those pesky occupants, oh my God, the stories that I've heard about occupants wanting to leave buildings on all night long because they were too lazy to go fill out the form to tell them, turn it on at this time, turn it on at that time. Nightmarish stuff for building building maintenance staff to keep up with this type of thing and then maintain their commitment to performance. So it's a real tug of war out there. And the more people you get buy-in with and involvement with, the better this stuff works. Because we can sit here and talk all night long about, oh, it's a risk, it's a risk. But if these owners and these people do your jurisdiction, and I think she talked about fines, that's kind of like the stick to get after people. But if we can create some more carrots, people have to be engaged in this process for it to work, period. That's at least the way I've seen it, because I've heard the horror stories too. And without that engagement, people are going to rebel, they're going to resist, and they're not going to do it. So I think along with putting together these opportunities for jurisdictions, and that's what Design to Earn and the Energy Star try to do, is give them a reward, an attaboy, attagirl. You got your Energy Star, you can kind of go around and feel good about it. So that's the part that we're trying to do, is bring about recognition and people taking that recognition to be a reward to encourage people with carrots instead of just sticks. So that's a long, drawn-out answer to something that it's all about commitment and working with people and building relationships and getting understanding from your stakeholders, getting the kids involved, getting the communities involved. And then we get something that people understand what they're doing, and not being chased after with a big stick like, oh, you must do this or you will get fined.
Right.
So that's
Definitely get the pushback there.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks. Yeah, and so I've seen some questions going in the chat. Looks like a lot of those are getting responded to. But if anyone on the call has, you could raise your hand if you want to come off mute to ask a question. I know we've got about 6 minutes left where we kind of wrap some things up. But as I mentioned in that one slide regarding like the challenges, and that's kind of what I was asking, the panelists around, the who, the what, the why, what are the problems, what are the concerns. I think obviously the pesky occupants is what, kind of hearing. You can't really rely on them. They're a huge liability. I have it on my desktop. It's a quote that I like. It's buildings don't use energy, people do. So you can put everything in there you want, but they could just turn it right off. They can use more energy than what you expected it to use. So I think that's why you're seeing these mechanisms like a BPS come in play to really begin to target the operations of a building. But how do we figure out those metrics? Because a BPS looks at the whole building and incorporates a lot more loads than what a lot of new construction does. So even if we construct and design it right, are we still capturing all of that total energy? Carolyn?
Yeah, I want to double down on the, just the benefits of recommissioning of buildings. And, as you noted, like people use energy, but, we know buildings go out of tune. And so one of the things we certainly have been thinking about and in conversations with some of our peer communities here in Colorado is just like the not losing sight of that recommissioning opportunity. It's most appropriate for the large buildings. We've seen less success with the smaller buildings, which may or may not have complex systems, but certainly for our over 50,000 square foot buildings, I think it really is an important element. And I think understanding how we can make ongoing commissioning tools more readily accessible or available and educating building owners around those, I think is a helpful carrot. I think, Dwayne had that on one of his slides as one of the things that, ongoing commissioning, I think is really valuable.
We called it tune-ups rather than retro commissioning because it sounded less threatening and people are kind of used to tune-ups with cars. And that I think that helped it along.
Is that what you call it, Colleen? Don't you have tune-ups as an option there?
We call it retro commissioning, but I love
You do? Oh, okay.
I'm writing it down.
Well, and I think that, that's sort of the goal of this too, is a lot of you are probably a part of that National Energy Codes Collaborative, aligning the energy codes, understanding how BPSs are working. There's other, I'm sure, BPS groups and coalitions trying to share resources and share, the heartaches that you're coming across and the different challenges and how you're navigating that. So I think that, as we continue to learn and unfold, BPSs across the country, what that real impact is going to be on both the existing building, but how that might revert back to the new buildings. And Dwayne, I think you've mentioned it, and maybe some others, it's how do you design a building and then hope that the occupants or the building owners are going to continue to operate it the same way. So that's where there's some of that liability and concerns of something like an outcome-based code for kind of prevent that from happening. But one thing I might pose as a question is looking the other way. If there's now a building performance standard in place and these occupants and building owners may have bought the building, 5-10 years ago or whatever, and in there, what happens if when that building was constructed, it didn't actually meet the code requirements to a T? Maybe there's some ways around, getting code compliance, energy code compliance and enforcement isn't necessarily at the top of the list in a lot of building departments because they care more about fire life safety. And the energy codes are usually complex. And so that's just a checkbox. How about liability on that end or on the existing building end where the building was never actually set up properly or had all of the strategies or equipment in place that should have helped us meet that energy code to get us, where we could, maybe with a quick tune-up, and we have to add all this stuff. To me, there seems like there is also liability on that end to put back on the design community to ensure that they're meeting those codes.
You don't mean to suggest that there are buildings that don't comply in every aspect with the energy code?
Yeah.
Heaven forbid, but it's it's going to be less of a problem for them than it is for buildings that were built in 1961 and when they hadn't even invented an energy code yet, and none of the schools were talking about energy efficiency. The average building in Seattle, I think, is just a little over 50 years old. So most of our buildings were built pre-energy code at all, and the really dark years were the like 60s through 90s, where maybe a 1985 building is probably horrible. I'm not that worried about the building that was put up 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I know we're approaching the end of this, and I want to get like one quick question or sort of response from everyone. But I think there's definitely some action items we can come away with this. One being, not to put pressure on everyone, how do we get more of these jurisdictions to maybe look at tools like design to earn? Can we layer that in, not to add more work for the building permit process, but begin to set that up to say, like, can we get a target EOI and then check that back, later on? Maybe there's some incentive programs there, quicker permitting or something to get, new buildings to try to go down that pathway and see how that handoff might work. But so as we close this out, I do want to just ask each of you, what's that one thing or what you think you need to have happen to help support the alignment of, sort of existing new buildings into existing buildings, or to make sure that your outcome-based policy can perform as successful as possible. So less than 20 seconds, what's the one thing you think you need? And I'll start with how my screen looks. Colleen?
I don't know if this exactly fits that, but I would say there's a few things I could pick. But one thing I mentioned earlier, which is reducing the burden for building owners to comply. And I don't know that really answers your question, but we're not, yeah, that's what I'm going with, that and quality data.
Yeah, quality data, that's a good one. Carolyn?
This is our, like, what's our big wish of what we can get to make this all easier. I think continuing to refine our understanding of what's feasible based on original construction of these buildings and where the limits are. The building science is continuing to evolve in that regard, and I think it will help us set targets. A lot of the BPSs have been using averages across all ages of buildings, and in my opinion, that's maybe not the appropriate or equitable outcome that we need to be working towards. And then understanding as a jurisdiction, then where do you set the targets? How do you adjust those based on vintage and materials of construction and things that are, going to keep people in the space of feasible and beneficial versus driving them to, the negative outcomes, which are, failure to comply, challenging regulation, simply walking away from buildings that are really critical, to, Colleen's point around our, more equity-centered buildings. Like we don't want to have negative outcomes. We still want to move the needle for them. And how far can we move the needle reasonably without like imposing exhaustive requirements around audits and analysis to get at those numbers? I think that's on my big wish list that we're noodling on.
All right. Thank you. Karen?
I would say it would be to get the owners, the A&Es, the O&Ms, and the engineers, and all of those guys in the room in the beginning of the process, and then the code officials or the jurisdictions, I would call it, or whatever name you want to give that person, and really have everybody get on board with understanding what the outcomes are that they want for their buildings, and then everybody understands the part that each one of them play in their role. And if there is a way, I should say the 1,000-pound elephant in the room, and if there's a way that AI can play a role in us doing our work in building sciences, then bring it on.
Awesome. And then Dwayne.
Yeah, I would say, can we move towards having monitoring and control systems for lighting HVAC, water heating, all those that are intuitive and maybe even fun to use and don't require a master's in mechanical engineering to understand them.
Gotcha. Well, that's where you get those in place, and then you just let AI and machine learning take it over, right?
Perfect.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thank you to the speakers. I really do appreciate y'all taking the time to present today. I know that we definitely could have probably kept going for many more hours to dive in even further to some of these challenges and ideas and various solutions. But for the folks on the call, if you've got other things that pop up, please pass that along. We can then share it with the speakers, and we'll continue to kind of usher this along, because I do think it's a key question mark about how do we continue to align energy codes and building performance standards, because we do want those buildings to just perform as the way we intended them to and be as efficient as possible. So thanks again to the speakers, and thank you all for attending, and look forward to seeing you on the next one. Appreciate it.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.